Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Bradley J. Show. Today we're speaking again with Rich Rubino, my favorite political guest, because he's just a well of information. And we're going to talk about a super interesting cat, Lyndon Baines Johnson, today. And this is going to be kind of politics for people who don't even care about politics. It's just based on what an interesting guy Lyndon Johnson was. And we're going to learn stuff about him today that, well, you didn't know. How you doing, Rich?
I'm doing well. This should be fun.
Tell the folks again about your books real quickly.
Yep, well, I have five books. The first one is the Political Bible of Little Known Facts in American Politics. Then there's the Political Bible of Humorous Quotations in American Politics. Make Every Vote Equal with a Novel Idea, which is about the history a little bit of the Electoral College. Then there's a book called Politics on the American Politics on the Rocks. And then my newest book is The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, about 500 pages of political trivia, hopefully mostly interesting, not just monotonous.
Hopefully, that's good. And today's episode is brought to you by Rick Walker's Rock and Roll Cowboy Clothes since 1932, new and vintage. I got my bandanas there. Ringo Starr has been there. They have jewelry, rock T-shirts, leather jackets, 306 Newbury Street, Back Bay, Boston. So, Lyndon Baines Johnson, we don't hear about him much. Why?
I actually think since the Robert Carroll books, the last few years, there's been kind of a recrudescence of him. But I actually think there has been a lot of I actually think there's been a lot of kind of coverage of him. He's actually one of the most influential presidents of the 21st century. Just if you think about it, the legacy is very bifurcated. On the one hand, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which he shepherded through the United States House of Representatives, United States Senate, very much a bipartisan piece of legislation. If you look at it, for example, every single Democrat from the North voted for it. In the South, with the one exception of non-Southern Democrats, was Robert Byrd from West Virginia. And in the South, every single Democrat, except for Senator Yarborough of Texas, voted against it. So it was very much regional as opposed to ideological, Republican or partisan Republican versus Democrat. You have the Civil Rights Act of 65, the Open Housing Act of 68, the establishment of the Medicare program, the Rat Extermination Act, elementary and secondary education, Head Start. We are very much living in Lyndon Johnson's America, more than probably any president of the last half of the 20th century. On the other side of that legacy, you have the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War, if you look at it, the first 2 years of his presidency were really the high watermark, I think, of liberalism in the 20th century. The second 2 years, I think many liberals who were very much supporting of him in the first 2 years, he almost became the Antichrist as he escalated the troops into Vietnam and lost a lot of those liberal supporters. And he became kind of a face card, if you will, or a tribune, if you will, of kind of the establishment of military-industrial complex. Many started to protest his actions in Vietnam. They started yelling, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many boys did you kill today?" So probably the most bifurcated legacy in American history. That's why he's so austere to rank.
As we look back at the Vietnam War now, it seems like an obvious mistake, but it must not have been that obvious back then.
Yep.
Why did poor LBJ stick with it so hard? What was the mindset at the time that even that a Democrat, albeit a Texas Democrat, would stick with a war like that?
Well, so Eisenhower sent in the first troops. When John F. Kennedy got in, there were about 600. When he left, there were about 16,000. Now, technically, they were considered advisors, but they were, for all intents and purposes, they were United States troops. So President Johnson comes in, and he sees that we've signed a treaty essentially in the 50s to protect South Vietnam, and really he sees no way out of that treaty. 1964, when you had the Tet Offensive, 1964 rather. I'm talking about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution,
Okay.
which essentially gave him carte blanche. He got that passed unanimously in the House of Representatives. Only two members of the United States Senate, Wayne Morse of Oregon and Senator Greening of Alaska, voted against it. There was really almost ecumenical or universal, if you will, support for doing something in 1964. Now, the fact that he kept escalating in 65, escalating in 66, escalated in 67, he was basically listening to William Westmoreland, listening to the generals, listening to his Defense Department and Robert McNamara and some of the hawks like Dean Rusk, for example. And these were called the wise men. The wise men were essentially mostly Kennedy people who said you have to keep proliferating, you have to keep sending more troops into Vietnam. And it became a boondoggle, and it became a point where he was doing this policy of gradual escalation, which was kind of very much middle of the road. There were some that said we should essentially, just wipe it out and just, draw them back to the Stone Age, use nuclear weapons, end the war like that.
Like Dulles would say that.
And then the Doves were saying the opposite. They were saying we need to get out, and Johnson just kept gradually escalating, so it was really not necessarily making either side happy. And as a result, there was that really effectuated a lot of civil unrest within the country.
Well, he was tortured over this. He personally hated doing it, but he did it anyway. Can you give me more insight on why he would follow through with something he hated doing so much? I just remember seeing photos of him in anguish in the White House, sending these boys over. But it was a political choice to not do this. He thought this was the thing to do to get reelected, or do you think it was the geopolitically correct thing to do?
I think I don't think that 1964, when he ran for reelection, this was after Kennedy had been assassinated, no Democrat was going to lose that election. And Barry Goldwater was an extremely weak Republican nominee who actually said in his address to the convention that year in San Diego and San Francisco in the Cow Palace, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. You talk in that type of language, you turn people off. Johnson was ahead by 40, 50 points. It wasn't about reelection. I do think it was potentially about impeachment. Had Johnson decided essentially to bring the troops home, I think the Democrats in Congress would have essentially said JFK's legacy when he gave his 1961 inauguration address, rather. He said, we shall bear any burden, essentially. He said, ask not what your country shall do for you, what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And they thought this was part of Kennedy's essential dream of a Cold War, essentially the argument being that we defend anybody who's fighting themselves against communism. And there was a domino effect. Dwight Eisenhower actually initiated this phrase, which is the argument that if Vietnam goes communist, Laos, Cambodia, eventually it kind of spreads around the world, and this kind of Leninist, Stalinist, Marxist, if you will, ideology eventually expands and expands and expands, and then eventually you can make the argument takes us over. But I think that's something that was part of it. I also think that he knew that the Democrats were seen, at least from the 1940s under the Truman administration, for having lost China. And then I think that he saw that, and I think he didn't want the Democrats to be seen, and he didn't want to be the person who kind of was seen as losing Vietnam to the communists. But I also think that he could not find a way out of it, because John F. Kennedy had essentially promised South Vietnamese that he would protect them. He had sent troops in there. But that being said, when he did run in 1964, he said this is a war that's should be fought by Vietnamese boys, not American boys. And it landed up to be certainly a war fought by South Vietnamese boys, but there were a lot of American boys there as well.
So that rhetoric on the right seemed extreme at the time, but that wouldn't seem extreme now, would it? I mean, that's the kind of thing you would say now. As we have this conversation about Johnson and a Johnson Democrat, I think it's always interesting to compare that to the way things are now. I mean, a Democrat then was nothing like a Democrat now, correct?
No, I think there's actually a lot of similarities.
All right, good.
I think because you hear this a lot about John F. Kennedy. People say, well, John F. Kennedy, if he were alive now, he'd be a Republican. And they say that in part because of certainly he was a hawk on the Cold War, and Johnson was kind of somebody who was kind of a fellow traveler, if you will. He was more of somebody who cared more about domestic policy than foreign policy, but got enveloped into Vietnam. But I think on domestic policy, Kennedy and Johnson Democrats, Hubert Humphrey, they wanted Medicare. They supported civil rights. This is not Southern Democrats. This is Northern and Western Democrats, if you will. They wanted more aid to education. And yes, Kennedy proposed a tax cut. And one of Johnson's first proposals when he became president was to get that tax cut through the United States Congress. But you got to remember at the time that it was seen as more of a Keynesian or a way, if you will, to get more money into the economy so that you could then get the money to spend, to use it more for federal expenditures. So there was a tax cut proposal by Kennedy, supported by Johnson, and some of the most liberal elements of the Democratic Party supported that tax cut. They also supported civil rights. So I think these parties are very similar in terms of domestic policy. Now, where the split was over the Vietnam War and foreign policy. The beginning of the Johnson administration, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, every solitary Democrat, with two exceptions of the Senate, everyone is liberal, as George McGovern, for example, Eugene McCarthy, voted for that. As the county's casualties mounted up between 65, 67, 68, gradually liberals walked away from that and formed kind of almost a different bloodline in the Democratic Party, which called for a withdrawal or at least a bombing halt of North Vietnam. And by 1968, you had this split at the Democratic Convention where there was actually a peace plank, and the peace plank failed, but it came relatively close. Of course, Hubert Humphrey ended up winning the nomination, the Democratic Party's nomination that year in 1968. And on September 30th, he broke from President Johnson. And said that I will support a unilateral bombing halt as an acceptable risk for peace. When he did that, many of the protesters, the anti-war people, came home to the Democratic Party. But you see this all the time. So if you remember in Chicago that year, 1968, there were protests, there were riots. Remember Mayor Daley? The reason that happened in part was because Eugene McCarthy, the senator from Minnesota, ran for president. Lyndon Johnson dropped out after Eugene McCarthy won 42% of the vote in the New Hampshire primary. Johnson had internal polling showing he would actually lose to McCarthy in Wisconsin. Hubert Humphrey had not participated in the primaries. So he comes to the convention with no delegates, and then he garners delegates by essentially those who supported the Vietnam War, the Johnson administration's execution of it at the convention. Today we call them superdelegates. So they wanted McCarthy. Humphrey comes out there as a supporter of the Vietnam War, wins the nomination, and then you have these protests. But when Hubert Humphrey started to distance himself from President Johnson, you could see some of those anti-war people coming closer to Hubert Humphrey. But here's what's interesting. Eugene McCarthy himself did not endorse Hubert Humphrey until the last week, 1 week before the actual election. On October 20th of that year, Hubert Humphrey was on Face the Nation. He was asked if Eugene McCarthy would support him, and he basically says, well, I don't know what he's going to do. And when Eugene McCarthy did support Hubert Humphrey, what essentially he said was, I've agreed to support Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and I ask that my supporters suffer with me.
Interesting. Talk about that crucial time after the Kennedy assassination, those few hours.
Yeah, very interesting. So this was in Texas. The reason both President Kennedy and Johnson were in Texas was a pivotal swing state. Kennedy won in 1960 in part because Lyndon Johnson was on the ticket and helped carry the state of Texas. There was a feud there at the time between the liberal Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was the only Southern Democrat to vote against the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and the conservative governor, John Connally, who had been Kennedy's naval secretary. So Kennedy and Johnson had come to Texas essentially to try to propitiate both sides and to show a unified front in the Texas Democratic Party. That's why they were in that car. That's why Kennedy was here. That's why John Connally was behind him. That's why Johnson was behind them. That's why Ralph Yarborough was there. So basically they set a unified front. And the story is that morning, John F. Kennedy called up Lyndon Johnson and said, well, we at least have two states, Massachusetts and Texas. Nellie Connally, John Connally's wife, said, well, Texas really loves you. And then Kennedy, of course, was assassinated. President Johnson was then sworn in on the airplane. Was sworn on the airplane. They went back to Washington. And this is fascinating. So they went back to Washington, and the thought was Johnson was going to go to the White House. But he didn't go to the White House, in part because the Kennedy staff was still there. So instead, he went to his own residence. And he went to his own residence, and a Secret Service agent named Blaine comes out, and here's what he thinks is an intruder. So he goes up there with a gun, thinking somebody's going to come in, puts it right at the head of the person who comes in, and that person was Lyndon B. Johnson. We came this close that day to losing two presidents. And if we had lost both of those presidents, John McCormick from Massachusetts, the Speaker of the House, would have de facto become President of the United States. So we came that close. Johnson then eventually appoints the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission, by the way, the last surviving member was Gerald Ford. who was the minority leader from the House of Representatives. He was trying to make it bipartisan. Earl Warren, of course, the Chief Justice of the United States, and basically that's where they came up with Arlen Specter. By the way, the future senator was really the person who really kind of effectuated the single bullet theory. But there are so many different theories, and President Johnson, if you listen to some of the Johnson tapes, believes somewhat it might have been retaliation, because he said the Kennedy administration had essentially instituted what he called Murder Inc. Essentially, whether it was trying to take out Castro or trying to take out the DM regime in South Vietnam, the Kennedy administration certainly was trying to assassinate foreign leaders, and he thought there might be some sort of blowback there.
We're with Rich Rubino, who is a political historian and very interesting. Now, there's a little bit of political minutia. I think is it true that the book that Johnson got sworn in was not actually a Bible, but it's something called a missal, which
it was. I think it was actually the verses. It was Catholic verses that they found that John F. Kennedy had, because they couldn't find it. And then Justice Sarah Hughes, who actually Johnson got when he was vice president, one of the few things based on his very little influence he had, he got Kennedy to essentially nominate him to the Supreme Court, and she was the one who swore in President Johnson. They were looking for something. By the way, this is all irrelevant. This is all pro forma, because under the Constitution, if a president dies, the vice president becomes president. Yeah. Now, there was some question about that back in 1841 when William Henry Harrison died and John Tyler became president. Some thought he should be considered acting president. Should he really be called president? Does he really have that power? He established that precedent. And so as a result, this was purely symbolic, and it really didn't matter, what if he did it on Mad Magazine.
So even though there's a 2.5 hour gap between time of death of President Kennedy and Johnson getting sworn in, there is he was president automatically. Okay. Now, Bobby, I understand, really, really did not like Lyndon Johnson. Probably more than his brother. Why is that? Was it because, the Kennedys were smooth and intellectual, and Johnson was a giant 6'3" behemoth, foul-mouthed guy, or was it deeper than that?
Yeah, well, the Kennedy family actually wanted Lyndon Johnson to run for president in 1956. He turned it down. That would have been a fool's errand, because Eisenhower was so popular. But there were certainly tensions between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Robert Kennedy certainly did not want Lyndon Johnson on the ticket in 1960. John F. Kennedy, by some accounts, wanted another one of his opponents for the nomination, Fife Symington from Missouri, who Harry S. Truman really was kind of the benefactor and really wanted to prop up as the nominee. But they decided they had to pick Johnson, in part because, first of all, they didn't think Johnson would accept it. Johnson actually went to John Nance Garner, the former Speaker of the House, and who became vice president. And John Nance Carter said, you should not take it. It's an awful job. But Johnson decided he would take it. And there were a lot of tensions between himself and Bobby Kennedy. During the Kennedy administration, for example, Lyndon Johnson wanted John F. Kennedy to sign an executive order essentially in support of civil rights. And Robert Kennedy was very much opposed to that. So that was one of the issues of tension between the two. Certainly, a lot of it does kind of go back to their style in many respects. I think Kennedy thought that Johnson, in his 1960 presidential campaign, had taken on the Kennedy family, and he took that as a personal affront. But that being said, when Lyndon Johnson did become president, Robert Kennedy was Attorney General. They had a relatively cordial, what could be a relatively cordial relationship. I think Kennedy wanted to be on the ticket that year as vice presidential running mate with Lyndon Johnson. Johnson called him up and told him he didn't make it, but said essentially, I think you're brilliant. Robert Kennedy ended up running for a Senate seat. Kenneth Keating, the incumbent Republican, was up for re-election, a very liberal Republican. And Robert F. Kennedy ran against him that year. And Lyndon Johnson came to New York and campaigned for Robert F. Kennedy. Johnson absolutely annihilated the Republican Barry Goldwater in the state of New York. And his coattails probably helped Robert F. Kennedy win the state of New York. So Lyndon Johnson, next few years, Robert Kennedy is a senator, and Robert Kennedy is very much a supporter of Johnson's domestic programs and much of his policy on Vietnam as well. But he starts to turn, 66, 67, on Vietnam, and as a result, there was a movement to get Bobby Kennedy to run against Lyndon Johnson for the nomination in 1968. Basically, the anti-war people are looking for an advocate, even though Kennedy was a former hawk. Now he becomes somewhat of a dove. And Kennedy refused. So eventually, they went to Senator Metcalf from Montana. Senator Metcalf refused. So they ended up going to Eugene McCarthy. And Eugene McCarthy, whose office was called the Office of Sleepy Hollow because he was known for not doing anything, was the one who took him up on the offer and said, you know what? I'm going to run for president. When Robert Kennedy finds out about this, he says, you're kidding. And all of a sudden, Eugene McCarthy gets in there and runs against Lyndon Johnson for president. These people these hippies, if you will, go clean for Gene. They shave their hair, they shave their beards. They go to Berlin, New Hampshire, and they campaign, and they go to houses of laborers, for example, and they say, you should support Eugene McCarthy. Consequently, Eugene McCarthy's anti-Vietnam War platform, he wins 42% of the vote in the state of New Hampshire, absolutely shocks the nation, and Lyndon Johnson ends up dropping out of the presidential race. As I say, there was a poll in Wisconsin showing that Johnson would lose. But the other reason, I think, in part, that Johnson didn't run for re-election, he knew that essentially Johnson men died before they were 65 years old. If he were to serve another term, especially with the country enveloped in Vietnam, he probably would not have made that. And of course, he died 2 days after what would have been his second full term.
We'll get into that a little bit more. Talk later. Talk about his personality and his. I mean, he was 6'3", second tallest only to, I guess, Abraham Lincoln, 6'4", and he's a massive dude. And we all know people like this. Does that help you in politics to be physically intimidating like that, or did it then maybe? And what else contributed to his success regarding his personality, related to his personality?
Yes, well, size does matter in the case of Lyndon Johnson. He would scare he became, remember, this is a guy in 1948. He gets elected, barely gets elected by 87 votes to United States Senate in the state of Texas, beating Coke Stevenson. By the end of his first term, he's already the minority leader of the United States Senate. Then essentially he becomes the majority leader of the United States Senate, all by 1955. So he's very powerful. Part of it is his side. Part of it is he knows where the bodies are buried. He knows how to manipulate different senators. He knows how to essentially, he'll say, we're going to give you this dam if you vote this way, for example. But also part of it was his personality. And there are certainly photographs of him, for example, talking to Dick Russell. And you can see him looking like this, and he'd be importuning him, sometimes touching the senator's buttons, really kind of scaring them. Another instance, in 1964, when George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, was visiting him, and Lyndon Johnson essentially looks at him. George Wallace, a very diminutive in stature. Lyndon Johnson, obviously 6'3". Lyndon Johnson's in the White House. Lyndon Johnson's in his bigger chair, if you will. George Wallace is down here, and then he talks to him about talking about why he needs to do more in Alabama to protect the protesters, for example. And at one point, he looks at him. And he says, I want to, let's not think about 1964, 1965. Let's think about 1985. And in 1985, do you want your tombstone to say George Wallace he built or George Wallace he hated? And George Wallace comes out the next day and says, Lyndon Johnson almost had me coming out for civil rights. So he was very much he was very much the person who could persuade somebody in that respect. But here's another example. He could use his influence, I guess, in a very Machiavellian way. Frank Church, a senator from Idaho, had been a vociferous ally and was very much an ally of Lyndon Johnson on domestic policy. 1967, Senator Church comes to the White House and says, Mr. President, I'm now going to oppose you on the Vietnam War. I think we need to go out. Lyndon said, well, why is that, Senator? And Senator Church says, well, I read an article by Walter Lippmann, and it really made the case that we need to leave Vietnam, and I think I agree with it. Lyndon Johnson looks at it and says, well, Senator, next time you want a dam built in Idaho, go see Walter Lippmann.
So in my naivete, it seems to me like Lyndon Johnson was really in the balance of public servant versus self-serving. He seems like he was a public servant to a pretty high degree. What do you think?
I think it's very nuanced. I think that certainly he was Machiavellian. I mean, for example, he knew part of it he was probably better at getting legislation and using opportunities. For example, think about it this way. The Civil Rights Act probably would not have passed had John F. Kennedy not been assassinated, but he used it essentially by saying, this is our legacy to John F. Kennedy. We have to get this passed, and it got passed. The next year, you had the March on Selma, the Edmund Pecos Bridge. You had Bull Connor, for example, putting the fire hoses on protesters. As a result, there was really enmity toward what was going on, toward the not to the protesters, but toward the government in Alabama. And President Johnson used that to garner the civil rights and to shepherd that through the United States Congress. 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And after the assassination, as a tribute to King, Johnson got the Open Housing Act, which essentially outlawed discrimination based on housing as a tribute to Martin Luther King Jr. So he was very good at seeing an opportunity. Now, that being said, he was also somebody who knew kind of, as I say, he knew where the bodies are buried, but also knew how to win elections, sometimes underhandedly. Brown and Root, for example, a construction company, he became very close allies with them when he was a congressman from Texas. And as a result, they gave him a lot of money. They gave a lot of money to Democrats. They would give him money, sometimes literally send it in cash, and he wouldn't know what to do with it. And of course, Brown and Root ended up getting a lot of government contracts as a result. So there's very much pay to play. There's very much reciprocity. So I would say that Lyndon Johnson, in many respects, was a public servant, but he was also, in many respects, a cold, calculating, Machiavellian politician who, to get from point A to point B, would sometimes, shall we say, shade the ethical lines.
Okay, let's finish up talking about post-presidency for President Johnson, because that's super interesting too. Go ahead and talk about what happened and maybe why you think it happened.
So Lyndon Johnson, 1968, part of the reason he dropped out of the race was he was going to lose in Wisconsin, and McCarthy had really almost upended him in New Hampshire. He was not popular. His job approval was about 36%. Americans had really soured on the Vietnam War. The people wanted essentially there to be a solution, and there was not a military solution. There was not a political solution. So 1968, Lyndon Johnson, he knows Johnson men die before they're 65 years old. So he decides he's not going to run for re-election. Now, interestingly, he had the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese agreeing to come and meet with the United States to try to work out a deal toward the end of the campaign, which probably would have given the election to the Democratic Vice President, Hubert Humphrey. The problem was the Nixon campaign, the Republican nominee, knew that if there were to be a deal, it would certainly have deleterious effects, disadvantageous effects, and would probably hurt the Nixon campaign. So Nixon sent an emissary, Anne Chennault, to the South Vietnamese government under President Tu, and said that they would get a better agreement if Richard Nixon became president. So the South Vietnamese arbitrarily pulled out of the talks. And Lyndon Johnson knew about this. He had the information, and he called up Everett Dirksen, the Senate Minority Leader, and he said essentially, this is treason, but we're not going to expose it. So Johnson leaves office, very unpopular at the time. By the way, when he was leaving office, mostly Democrats came to kind of wish him well. The one Republican who came was a young congressman from Houston named George H.W. Bush, who would come to essentially greet Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson later said he'd never forget that. Wow. So the plane ride home, Lyndon Johnson starts smoking. Now, back in 1955, at 46 years old, he'd had a heart attack. And he had a heart attack, and on the way to the hospital, he said, "Can I have a cigarette?" And the doctor said, "This could be your last cigarette. This would be the last cigarette if you do have one." He supposedly never had one. He may have. We don't know if he snuck or not, but so he somewhat took care of himself. 1969, the plane ride to Texas. He lights up and starts smoking, and his daughter comes up and says, "Daddy, you haven't done that since 1955. Johnson says, "Well, I've raised you two girls. I've been president. This is my time." He goes back to Texas, grows his hair long. Now, what the psychological study with this would maybe perhaps, if you're a psychologist, maybe you would say that this is because he was trying to show a certain kinship with the folks who protested him, to say that he really was kind of one of them. Mm-hmm. So he grows his hair long, gains 25 pounds, goes back to Texas, essentially hangs out on the ranch. And he was a consummate politician. He used to say that I rarely do I think about politics more than 18 hours a day. So instead of having cabinet meetings, he would have meetings on his ranch. He would bring his field hand. He would bring his field hand for a cabinet meeting, and they would say, this is what we're going to do with this cow today. This is what we're going to do with this cow today. So instead of deciding, the nuclear test ban, but we're making agreements between nuclear powers. Now it was what was going to happen on his ranch. In 1972, a lot of Democrats abandoned their nominee that year, George McGovern. George McGovern they thought was too liberal. John Connally led the movement of Democrats for McGovern. Democrats for Nixon, rather, the incumbent Republican president who was relatively popular. McGovern landed up going to Texas and meeting with Lyndon Johnson. By the way, Bill Clinton was his co-chairman of the Texas campaign to try to get his support without necessarily getting. Johnson looked at him and he said, there are a lot of Democrats that want me to endorse Nixon because they think you're too liberal, and I just want to let you know that they don't have me, and I'm not one of them. So he said, you think I'm crazy as hell in this war? I think you're crazy as hell in this war. So let's talk about where we agree. Then he said, essentially, I think the Republicans are too much for big business. And then he talked about how he has to unify the fractions of the Democratic Party. And he comes out, and this is the endorsement McGovern got from Johnson. He says, I support the Democratic Party's nominee because I believe it is best for the country, without mentioning George McGovern's name. Privately, he said that George McGovern really had no chance at the nomination. But interestingly, in the primary, he was supposed to be neutral, even though Hubert Humphrey was one of the candidates. But Terry Sanford, the former governor of North Carolina, later became president of the University of North Carolina, former senator, came to Texas, and Lyndon Johnson met with him, and Lyndon Johnson gave him a copy of his book, Vantage Point, and in there was a $500 contribution. So 1972-73, he does interviews with Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite interviews him, and you can see these on YouTube. They're absolutely amazeballs. And he does one, and by the way, he attends Harry Truman's funeral. Truman had died on December 26th of that year, and he attends the funeral, and you could tell in that funeral that he was not well. He has a civil rights symposium in his library in Texas right before he dies, and he attends there, and you could see he was kind of very much struggling to walk, for example, gave a speech, and then he did this last interview about 10 days before with Walter Cronkite, where he looked back on his presidency, looked back on Vietnam, but really looked back upon civil rights. Then on January 22nd, he essentially has a heart attack, and dies, and he was 64 years old. Johnson men generally die before they're 65, and he died 2 days after what would have been, if he had served a second term, what would have been that second term. And it was the same day, of course, that the Roe v. Wade decision was decided. So as a result, the coverage is Lyndon Johnson dies, and it's a very small story about the Roe v. Wade decision as well. But he's just a very bifurcated figure in American history.
So did he die basically of smoking and or congestive heart failure or something?
Congestive heart failure, more or less. But he really did let himself go. And if you look at pictures of him in 72 and 73, he looks nothing like the man who took the presidency over in 1963. Not at all.
It's tough to not let yourself go. I mean, we all fight. Well, I fight against it every day. It would be so easy just to let myself go. But this Lyndon Johnson story will keep me on the straight and narrow a little bit. Do you find, one final question, was politics more interesting then than now? Because now, with everybody so hard-lined on each side, it's not as, it's more predictable. Therefore, I would say less interesting. But you tell me.
I think there's an eerie similitude between these times and those times. 1968 is probably the closest historically analogy to what's going on now in terms of the country being so divided, so fractious over civil rights, over Vietnam, over domestic policy, over the role of the federal government. So it's very interesting. I think that part of it is, in those times, it was not necessarily about party, it was about region. That's where it's different. So the Democratic Party, you had Northern liberals like Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota, Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts. President Johnson became kind of their champion on domestic policy. Then you had Southern conservatives, who today would be Republicans, senators like Senator James Eastland from Mississippi, John Stennis from Mississippi. they were all essentially under the umbrella of the Democratic Party. The parties were not ideologically homogenous the way they are today. And on regional issues, on civil rights, Democrats in the South were different than Democrats in the North. And on the Republican side, you had what is called a liberal Republican. Ed Brooke from Massachusetts, Jacob Javits from New York, for example, Clifford, there are plenty of liberal Republicans who would certainly not be welcomed in today's Republican Party. And most of them were in the Northeast. But then on the western side, you had more libertarian conservatives like Barry Goldwater from Arizona, for example. Now what you have is you have ideological homogenous parties where you have a liberal wing of the Democratic Party, a conservative bloodline in the Republican Party, and a few centrists right here who come from very kind of marginal districts or marginal states, if you will. But it's Democrats versus Republicans. Back then, it was the conservative Democrats and the conservative Republicans versus the liberal Republicans and the liberal Democrats. If you ever want to really kind of define this, it's called the Conservative Coalition. The Conservative Coalition was conservative Democrats. There were John Birch Society members that were members of the Democratic Party and conservative Republicans. And then there was a more liberal coalition in both parties as well.
All right. Rich, you're available for talks. You do talks, right? How does someone get in touch with you to have you do a talk for their organization?
Yep, I certainly do. You can just find me. Just Google Rich Rubino, Rubino. Certainly find me here on Facebook, and we can certainly work that out. And I do a lot of radio shows as well.
Okay. And your books, 5 books, why don't you run through them again?
Yes. The Political Bible of Little-Known Facts in American Politics, The Political Bible of Humorous Quotations in American Politics, Make Every Vote Equal, What a Novel Idea, American Politics on the Rocks, and The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids.
Rich Rubino, thank you very much. Let's, over the next few days, figure out what to do next. Really appreciate you being on the program, and all the best.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. We'll be